They threw his jacket on the ground and stole his seat. But when his name was announced, the whole party stopped breathing. Darius Holt didn't think twice when he draped his jacket over the back of that chair. He was only stepping away for a minute, just long enough to greet the host and grab a glass of sweet tea. The engagement party in Tempe, Arizona was louder than he expected, full of friends, coworkers of coworkers, and people who seemed determined to treat a backyard celebration like a red carpet event. But Darius didn't mind. He wasn't here to be seen. He was here because the groom asked personally. But the moment he worked his way back through the crowd, weaving between tables and laughing conversations, he stopped short. His chair was taken. Not just the chair, his jacket was on the ground. His seat was occupied by a couple who looked way too comfortable to be apologizing anytime soon. The man had a sharp haircut and a watch that tried too hard. The woman sat beside him, tilting her head in a way that suggested she believed every room belonged to her. Darius blinked, calm but confused. He stepped closer. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice warm. "Sorry, this was my seat. I left my jacket there." The woman didn't even look at him at first. The man glanced up, slow and dismissive, the way someone glances at a waiter they don't plan to tip. "Oh," the man muttered, giving a half smile that wasn't really a smile. "Yeah, we're actually saving this spot." Darius pointed gently to the jacket on the ground. "Right, but I was sitting here. I just stepped away." The woman finally looked at him. She raised her brows as though she'd been interrupted during something very important. "We're saving it for someone," she said plainly. "There are chairs open in the back." It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Darius felt the shift. Not anger, just clarity. He saw the way they sized him up in half a second, the way they decided he wasn't someone whose seat mattered. He didn't make a scene. He didn't raise his voice. That wasn't him. But there was a tiny pause before he replied, and anyone who knew him well would have recognized it. That pause meant he was choosing patience. "I understand," he said slowly, "but that seat was mine." The man smirked, lifted his drink, and replied, "Well, it is what it is." A few nearby guests glanced over, not enough to intervene, just enough to notice something was off. Darius picked up his jacket from the ground and dusted it lightly with his hand. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't defeated. He was simply thinking. The woman, clearly wanting the conversation to end, waved her hand dismissively toward the back row. "Really, there are chairs back there. You'll still see the slideshow." Darius didn't move. For a moment, neither did they. Then he stepped back. Not because they told him to, but because he didn't want to push a moment that didn't deserve his energy. But as he stood there, holding his jacket, a funny thing happened. Someone across the yard caught sight of him and started walking toward him. Someone who knew exactly who Darius was and why this night mattered far more than the couple sitting in his seat could have imagined. But the couple didn't notice that person approaching, and that's when everything quietly began to shift. Hours before the seat drama, Darius Holt had been in a completely different mindset. That morning, he'd been tucked inside a small cafe in Scottsdale, Arizona, sipping on a caramel coffee and answering emails from people who had no idea he lived anywhere near them. That's how Darius liked it. Quiet success, low recognition, no spotlight. His work in tech had put him in a comfortable place, but you'd never know it unless someone else told you. He wore simple clothes, drove an older SUV, and carried himself like someone who preferred grocery stores over galas. When the groom, his longtime friend Troy, invited him to the engagement party, Darius almost said no. Not because he didn't care. Troy was one of the few people he actually trusted, but because gatherings always had a way of turning into something he didn't ask for. Attention, conversations he didn't want, people sizing him up. Still, Troy insisted. "Man, I need you there," he'd said over the phone. "You helped me more than you know. Just show up, eat something, smile, that's it." So Darius agreed. By the time he arrived that evening, the backyard was already full. Strings of warm lights stretched across the space, a slideshow of photos flickered on a projector screen, and tables overflowed with finger foods. Kids ran around chasing each other while adults tried not to spill their drinks. It was the kind of event where the music was just loud enough to make you repeat yourself every time you spoke. Troy spotted him almost immediately. "There he is," Troy said, pulling him into a quick hug. "Man, I'm glad you made it." Darius smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." They talked for a few minutes. Work, life, wedding plans, before Troy was pulled away by another relative who needed a photo. Darius laughed. waved him off, and started looking for a place to sit. That's when he found the chair. A simple folding chair tucked near the middle, close enough to the slideshow to see everything clearly. He laid his jacket across the back of it and sat for a moment, listening to the mix of laughter and conversation around him. It felt good to just blend in. A woman nearby accidentally bumped his knee with her purse and apologized with a quick laugh. "My bad. These walkways are too tight." "All good," Darius said, smiling. He chatted briefly with an older man who asked if he worked in construction. "No, I'm in tech," Darius answered. "Oh, nice," the man said with a friendly nod before wandering off toward the snack table. The whole atmosphere felt harmless, familiar. Darius stood to grab a drink, keeping an eye on his seat so he could slide right back into it when he returned. He wasn't thinking about anything but the tea he was about to pour. And while he stood at the drink station, he overheard two people behind him talking, voices he didn't recognize. "Did you hear?" one asked. "They said that investor guy is here tonight." "Yeah," the other replied. "Apparently he's the reason they could afford this whole setup." Darius looked down at his cup, amused. Nobody ever expected the investor to look like him, and he liked it that way. But when he turned to head back to his seat, tea in hand, he saw two strangers settling into the spot where he'd been sitting minutes earlier. His jacket lay on the ground like it meant nothing, but he hadn't met them yet, and he didn't know their names. Not until he walked back toward that chair and everything changed. Darius didn't rush. He walked toward his chair with the same calm stride he always had, but his eyes stayed locked on the couple now planted in his spot. The man leaned back like he owned the place, one ankle crossed over his knee, while the woman scrolled through her phone with a bored expression. Darius glanced down. His jacket was still on the ground, half stepped on. He stopped right in front of them. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his tone even. "That was my seat." The woman didn't answer. She lifted her eyes just enough to glance at him, then dropped them back to her phone. The man had the nerve to look annoyed that Darius had spoken to him at all. "Yeah," the man muttered, waving a hand lazily. "We're saving it for someone." "For who?" Darius asked. The woman sighed, finally looking at him as if she'd been waiting for the right moment to sound irritated. "For someone important," she said. "You can find another seat. There's a row open in the back." There it was again. That subtle sting wrapped inside a smile that wasn't a smile. Her eyes didn't just dismiss him. They judged him. Darius didn't react immediately. He thought about Troy, about the simple night he expected to have, about the last thing he wanted, a confrontation in the middle of someone else's celebration. "I was sitting here," he repeated. "I left my jacket." He picked it up off the floor, brushing off the bit of dust. Some guests nearby quieted their conversations just a little, pretending to mind their own business, but clearly listening. The man shrugged. "Well, we're here now." It wasn't loud. It wasn't rude in the traditional sense. But the disrespect was woven so tightly into their tone that it almost sounded polite if you didn't listen closely. Darius pressed his lips together for a second. "What's your name?" he asked calmly. The man answered with a smirk. "Evan, and this is Marissa." Neither of them offered a handshake. They didn't ask for his name. Evan just leaned farther back in the chair that wasn't his. "Nice to meet you," Darius said anyway. "But you're in my seat." Marissa tucked her hair behind her ear and gave a little laugh. "Look," she said, "we're waiting for someone who needs to sit up front. You'll still see the slideshow from the back. It's really not that serious." Not that serious. It was a phrase people used when they expected you to swallow disrespect without reacting. Darius kept his voice level. "I don't mind if your friend sits somewhere else. I just want my seat back." "Right," Evan replied, "but we're comfortable here. I'm sure you understand." The arrogance tasted thick in the air. A woman at the next table watched the exchange, her eyes bouncing between them. At one point, she opened her mouth, maybe to step in, then closed it again, deciding this wasn't her battle. Darius took a slow breath. He could insist. He could push the point. He could make a scene. But he didn't. "All right," he said quietly, slipping his jacket over his arm. Evan smiled, like that was some kind of victory. "See, there you go," Marissa added. "Enjoy the slideshow." Darius didn't answer. He took a step back, feeling eyes on him from a few directions. People weren't talking, but they were paying attention. He found an empty spot against the side fence, leaned there for a moment, and let his pulse steady. It wasn't about a chair. It never was. It was about the instant judgment in their voices, the quick decision that he wasn't someone worth respecting. He watched Evan and Marissa continue chatting, clueless and comfortable, acting like nothing had happened. And maybe to them, nothing had. But there was someone else walking his way now. Someone who had seen the exchange differently. Someone who wasn't about to let the couple's behavior slide, not after recognizing who Darius actually was. But Evan and Marissa still had no clue, and that ignorance was about to set the stage for something they could never have prepared for. A few minutes passed, and Darius stood near the fence, sipping his drink and watching the crowd shuffle in their seats. He thought maybe the awkward moment would fade, that Evan and Marissa would go back to minding their own business, and the night could move on. But that's not how things played out, because the moment they spotted him standing off to the side, alone, holding his jacket, they didn't stay quiet. Marissa leaned toward Evan and whispered something, but not nearly soft enough. "He's still standing there," she murmured. "Why doesn't he just sit somewhere else?" Evan snickered. "Maybe he thought we'd move if he stared long enough." Darius heard every word, though he pretended not to. The couple's table mates exchanged looks, some uncomfortable, some pretending they hadn't heard anything at all. A young woman, sitting 2 chairs down from Evan, finally spoke. "You know," she said gently, "he really was sitting there first." Marissa turned to her with a look that mixed annoyance and entitlement. "And," she said, "we're saving the seat." "For who?" the woman asked. Evan straightened up slightly, as if preparing to impress someone. "For our business partner," he said, lowering his voice a bit like he was sharing a secret worth money. "He's supposed to stop by, someone who actually matters for our future." The woman's smile thinned. "Still doesn't mean you should throw someone's jacket on the ground." Marissa laughed, short and sharp. "Please, it's a party, not a courtroom." "That's not the point," the woman said, quieter now. "It was rude." Evan's jaw shifted a little, pride stinging. "Look, we're trying to build something real. We can't have our partner shoved in the back row. If that guy wanted the seat so badly, he should have stayed in it." Darius felt the sting of that one, but he stayed where he was. He wasn't about to get into a tug-of-war over a chair with 2 adults who acted like uninvited teenagers at a barbecue. A few feet away, another guest, a man named Rodney he'd met once or twice, walked over to Darius with a half smile. "You good?" Rodney asked. Darius nodded. "Yeah." "Looked like those 2 were giving you trouble." Darius chuckled softly. "They're saving the seat for someone important." Rodney shook his head. Funny how people define that word. Before Darius could respond, Evan raised his voice just enough to be overheard. "Marissa, did you send the pitch deck to the guy from Austin? He said he wanted something polished before we meet next week." "Yeah," she said. "And you know what would help us look even more prepared? Meeting that investor tonight. If he sees we belong up front, it sets a tone." Darius's brow lifted slightly. Investor, tonight. He didn't say anything out loud, but the irony settled on him like warm air. Rodney lowered his voice. "They're talking about the guy funding the community center project, aren't they?" "Sounds like it," Darius replied. Rodney gave him a look, wide-eyed, almost amused. "And they don't know?" "No," Darius said. "Not even close." The host, Troy, moved around the crowd with a microphone, trying to gather attention for a quick announcement. People quieted down slowly, shifting in their seats. Evan straightened his shirt and whispered to Marissa, "This is it. They might introduce him soon. Make sure he sees us up front." She adjusted her hair and smiled, proud of herself for holding the seat. "We're exactly where we should be." Rodney shot Darius a look that said everything without words. Darius just sighed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't plotting revenge. He simply knew the truth had a way of walking into a room without needing permission, or a seat up front. Troy tapped the microphone twice. "All right, everyone," he said. "Give me 30 seconds. I want to thank someone really special tonight. Someone who helped make this engagement party possible." Evan and Marissa both sat up straighter, practically glowing with anticipation. Troy continued, "And someone who stepped up big time for the new community center fund." Marissa clasped her hands together. Evan exhaled like the moment he'd been waiting for his whole life had arrived. But the name coming next would hit them harder than anything they'd expected. But before Troy said it, the crowd needed to settle, and that silence only made what happened next even sharper. Troy stood near the projector screen, smiling as the crowd started to quiet down. The clinking of glasses slowed, conversations faded, and eyes drifted toward him with curiosity. The warm lights above gave everything a soft glow, and for a second, the entire backyard felt still. Meanwhile, Darius stayed by the fence, shoulders relaxed, face unreadable. He never liked having attention pointed at him, not even when it came from people who respected him. And tonight, the last thing he wanted was to be the center of anything. But he also knew Troy well enough to know there was no dodging this moment. Across the yard, Evan leaned forward in his stolen seat, whispering excitedly to Marissa. He's definitely talking about him. Finally. Marissa crossed her legs, sitting with the posture of someone rehearsing confidence. Good, she whispered. We need to make the right impression. They had no idea. Most people in that backyard didn't know much about Darius. They saw a quiet guy with simple clothes and an old SUV, a man who kept to himself, someone who blended into a crowd rather than standing out. But that was the thing. Darius built his life that way on purpose. He grew up in Bakersfield, California, in a small apartment behind a laundromat. His mom worked long hours, his dad bounced from job to job, and every dollar had a job before it reached the house. Darius learned early that money wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was the people pretending who made noise. He studied computer engineering at a community college because he couldn't afford anything else. Then he spent his nights building small apps, freelancing, and learning every piece of code he could get his hands on. Years passed, and those small projects turned into something bigger, sales, partnerships, and one app that exploded far beyond what he expected. Suddenly, he had more money than he knew what to do with. But even then, he never announced it. He didn't buy designer clothes. He didn't upgrade every year to whatever the world was obsessing over. He didn't feel the need to flash status like a badge. He used his money quietly, helping where he could, investing where it mattered, supporting people who didn't expect it. One of those people was Troy. The new community center they were planning to build on the south side of Tempe, the one aimed at helping teens learn coding, trades, and entrepreneurship. Darius was the one pushing the funding behind it, not because he wanted credit, but because he knew what it felt like to need opportunity and not have it. None of that showed on his face as he stood by the fence, watching Evan and Marissa soak in the attention they thought belonged to them. The yard buzzed with that special kind of anticipation that sits right in the middle of admiration and curiosity. People were waiting to see who Troy would call out. Some expected a big-time businessman. Others imagined someone with a polished suit and a firm handshake. No one expected the quiet man holding a jacket near the fence. Rodney, still standing beside him, gave a low chuckle. You're really about to knock their night sideways, you know that? Darius shrugged, not intentionally. Oh, I know, that's why it's going to hit even harder. Behind them, Marissa whispered, Smile. Make sure you look approachable when he walks over. Evan straightened his posture more. Trust me, once he sees we saved a seat up front, he'll respect that. Rodney muttered under his breath, Oh, he'll see something. Troy lifted the mic again. All right, y'all, let me introduce you to someone who changed everything for us. The crowd leaned in. Evan and Marissa held their breath. Rodney looked at Darius with a knowing grin, but Troy didn't call the name yet. He paused, giving the moment just enough air to tighten every expectation in the yard before dropping the truth. Troy lowered the microphone for a moment, scanning the tables like he was searching for the right face. People leaned closer, trying to guess who he was about to point out. Some guests even straightened their shirts and sat taller, just in case the spotlight swung their way. Meanwhile, Evan adjusted his collar again, whispering to Marissa, This is it. Watch how fast he comes over here. Marissa smoothed her dress and crossed her legs the other way. He's definitely going to introduce himself after this, she whispered. This seat is exactly where we needed to be tonight. Not far from them, Rodney looked like he was holding in a laugh. Darius stood quietly, watching Troy prepare to finish the announcement. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look excited. He simply looked ready. But before Troy could bring the mic back up, someone else approached the couple's table, a guy named Seth, one of the groom's co-workers. He walked up holding a plate of appetizers, smiling at everyone like he was already mid-conversation. You two enjoying yourselves? He asked. Marissa brightened instantly. Yes, absolutely. We've got front row seats. Seth nodded politely. Nice. By the way, did you ever figure out who you were saving those seats for? Oh, totally. Evan jumped in. We're waiting for an investor we're trying to meet. Heard he's supposed to be here tonight. Seth paused for half a beat. Really? And who told you the guy would want to sit up front? Marissa lifted her chin slightly. It just makes sense. He'd want to be where people can approach him. Seth blinked, then tilted his head. Are you sure? The person funding this place isn't really the front row type. Evan frowned. Meaning what? Seth shrugged. I've met him once. Real low-key dude. Doesn't dress flashy. Doesn't talk much about his business. Kind of blends in. The look on Evan's face tightened. That doesn't sound like an investor. Seth raised a brow. Some of the wealthiest people you'll ever meet don't look like what you expect. Marissa crossed her arms. Well, whoever he is, we'll know soon. Seth let out a small breath like he was trying not to say more. Yeah, you will. He walked off, leaving Evan and Marissa momentarily confused. Rodney leaned toward Darius with a quiet grin. You heard that, right? I did, Darius said. You're a patient man. I try. Across the yard, a cousin of the bride, a chatty woman named Denise, wandered over holding 2 cupcakes. She spotted Darius and smiled wide. There you are. I was looking for you earlier, she said. Darius chuckled softly. Everything all right? Oh, yes. I just wanted to thank you again for what you're doing for the kids in the neighborhood. The center is going to be huge for them. Evan heard that. His head snapped around so fast, Marissa noticed. Denise kept going, completely unaware of the tension forming behind her. I told my nephew about the computer lab idea, and he hasn't stopped talking about it. You really don't know how much this means to everyone. Darius smiled warmly. I'm glad it helps. That's the goal. Denise nodded, patted his arm, and walked back toward the dessert table. Evan's expression had changed. Subtle, but noticeable. He leaned toward Marissa. What did she mean by that? Marissa shrugged. She probably thinks he volunteers or something. But Evan didn't look satisfied with that answer. His eyes stayed locked on Darius now, like he was suddenly trying to solve a puzzle he didn't realize he'd been handed earlier. Troy finally raised the microphone again. All right, everyone. Thanks for waiting. I promise I won't take long. I just want to acknowledge someone who has completely changed the direction of our community project. Someone who stepped in, believed in us, and gave us the support we didn't think we would get. People turned their bodies toward him. Evan leaned forward so far his chair squeaked. Marissa placed a hand on her chest like she was preparing for her close-up. Rodney folded his arms and glanced sideways at Darius. Troy continued. This person didn't ask for recognition. They didn't want their name in lights, but we wouldn't be standing in this amazing space tonight without them. Evan whispered, Get ready. And across the yard, Troy's eyes finally found the man he'd been looking for. He smiled, lifted the mic, opened his mouth. But what came out next wasn't the name Evan and Marissa were waiting for, and their entire table felt the shift the second Troy spoke. Troy took a breath, lifted the microphone, and said the name as clearly as if he were announcing a championship winner. Everybody, please help me thank Darius Holt. For 2 full seconds, the backyard didn't move. Not a blink, not a sip, not a whisper, just silence. Then, like someone pressed play again, the reaction started rolling through the crowd. Heads turned sharply toward the fence. Mouths parted without sound. A couple of relatives even clapped before they realized no one else had started yet. And right in the middle of all of it, Evan and Marissa whipped around so fast their chairs scraped the concrete. They stared at Darius, who stood exactly where he had been the whole time, holding his jacket and watching the moment play out with the calmest expression in the entire yard. Troy waved him forward. Darius, man, don't just stand back there. Come up here. People shifted to clear a path. Some guests smiled wide. Others whispered to each other, trying to piece together how the quiet man near the fence was the one responsible for everything tonight. Evan's voice cracked. Marissa, is he serious? That can't be the guy. Marissa didn't answer. Her eyes were glued to Darius, confusion and disbelief mixing on her face like 2 colors she didn't know how to blend. Rodney gave Darius a gentle nudge. Go on, they're waiting. Darius nodded and stepped forward, moving through the crowd slowly. People patted his shoulder, whispered thanks, smiled at him like they'd just discovered a secret they should have known all along. And at the center of it, Evan sank farther into the chair he stole, looking smaller by the second. As Darius approached, Troy grinned and shook his hand. Everybody, this is the man right here. Without him, the new community center wouldn't be happening. We owe him a whole lot. A Applause broke out. Real applause this time, loud and warm. Marissa swallowed hard. Evan, we threw his jacket on the ground. Evan didn't blink. I know. And we told him to sit in the back. I know. And we said the seat was... I know, Marissa. She sank back, covering her mouth. Her confidence had evaporated, leaving only embarrassment and the realization that she'd misread absolutely everything. Troy continued, Darius has been funding the early construction, the equipment, the programs, everything. He even helped us lock in the venue tonight. And trust me, he didn't want any of this attention, but we weren't about to let him hide. The cheers grew louder. Darius smiled politely, but didn't raise his hands or soak in the praise. He just nodded, grateful but humble, like he always was. Meanwhile, people near Evan and Marissa's table began shifting their chairs away, not dramatically, but enough to create space. A few gave the couple looks that said a lot without words. Someone whispered, "That's the guy they were rude to." Another shook her head slowly. Marissa leaned toward Evan. "This is bad," she whispered. Evan ran a hand over his face. "No, this is worse than bad." Back at the front, Troy handed the microphone to Darius. "Say something, man. Doesn't have to be long." Darius held the mic gently, looking around the backyard. "I appreciate all of you," he said. "Really. But I didn't do this for recognition. I just want the kids in the neighborhood to have chances I didn't." The crowd let out another warm wave of applause, but the couple who took his seat didn't clap. Instead, they sat frozen, watching the reality sink deeper and deeper into their stomachs. Darius handed the mic back to Troy and stepped aside, but before he could fully move away, Troy motioned him toward the couple's table. "Oh, Darius," he said, "you should talk to them. They've been trying to meet the investor all night." The yard erupted into a quiet sea of, "Oh no, wow, and this is about to get awkward." Evan and Marissa looked like they wanted the earth to open and swallow them whole. Darius walked toward them with the same calm steps he'd had all evening. Evan scrambled to stand. Hey, he stammered. We, didn't know." Marissa nodded aggressively. "We had no idea, really." Darius looked at them softly, not angry, not smug, just steady. "I know you didn't," he said. Evan swallowed. "We saved the seat for someone important." Darius lifted one shoulder in a small, almost gentle shrug. "Guess I just didn't look important enough." They couldn't respond. There was no response. But the real lesson hadn't been spoken yet, and that moment was coming next. Evan and Marissa stood there, stuck between apology and panic, trying to piece together how the night slipped so far out of their hands. The crowd had already begun shifting back into normal conversation, but the energy around their table was different. Heavy, uncomfortable, honest. Evan tried again, clearing his throat like the right words might magically show up. "Listen, we messed up. Badly. We shouldn't have talked to you the way we did." Marissa nodded quickly, her voice quieter than it had been all night. "It wasn't right. We judged you before knowing anything, and we made assumptions we shouldn't have." Darius studied them for a moment, not to make them squirm, not to hold power over them, just to understand what kind of people they were when the mask finally came off. "It's okay to have bad moments," he said calmly, "but it's not okay when those moments come at someone else's expense." Marissa lowered her eyes. "We're really sorry." Darius gave a slow nod. "I hear you." Evan took a breath, trying to salvage any dignity he still had. "If there's any chance we could restart, maybe explain our business idea." Darius didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He simply answered with honesty most people never hear. "Tonight wasn't the time for that," he said. "And the way you treated me earlier, it tells me all I need to know about how you treat people when you think they're not useful to you." Evan's face dropped. Marissa looked away. Rodney, who'd been standing nearby, just in case things escalated, stepped closer with a small smile. "He's being polite," Rodney murmured. "Trust me. Some folks would have handled this very differently." Darius turned to leave, but before he walked off, he added one last thing. "There's nothing wrong with wanting success, but you can't build anything real if you treat people based on what you think they're worth. That always catches up to you." With that, he walked away, not triumphant, not bitter, just done with the moment. Evans sank slowly back into the chair he never should have taken. Marissa stared at the grass, twisting her bracelet between her fingers. The party continued around them, but their night was over long before the lights dimmed. People came up to Darius to shake his hand, thank him, or offer a hug. Kids pointed at him like he was a hero, even if he didn't see himself that way. Troy wrapped an arm around his shoulder and said, "I knew you'd handle it better than I would have." Darius just smiled. It wasn't worth turning into something bigger. Later, as he left the backyard and walked toward his SUV, he glanced back at the laughter, the music, and the warm lights. The night hadn't gone how he expected, but maybe it went how it needed to. Because moments like this aren't really about embarrassment. They're about truth, about character, about what we reveal when we think nobody's watching. And if there's one thing this night taught everyone there, it's simple. Never judge someone by what you think they are. Judge them by how they treat people, especially when there's nothing to gain. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you stick around for the next one. There's always another moment, another lesson, and another reminder that character never hides for long.